there, everybody. It's Matt from the History Things Podcast. Welcome back. We're going to be doing one of our follow-up episodes for you today. First off, let me introduce my co-host, who's always with me here at the podcast. You know him not only from this podcast, but also from his own work with History Things with Pat. It's my good buddy, Pat McGuire.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show. Follow-up episode number 2. Good to be back doing the follow-up show, Matt.
Absolutely. Now, we had for episode number 2 our buddy Avery Lentz. Avery, you're with us?
Yes, I am. Thanks for having me back, guys.
Absolutely. We're going to be shooting a bunch of questions at you today, bud. But first off, how's everybody doing with all of this shutdown and virus awfulness?
I'm over it.
I'm doing.
Over it.
I am over it as well. I'm also apartment hunting in the middle of this, so that's fun. There is a silver lining. Prices have been reduced by many leasing companies that I've talked to. So,
all right.
are
you staying here? Are you staying here in Frederick so we can keep the triumphant?
That's the goal.
Going?
Yep, that is the goal, sir.
For those of you who are unaware, all 3 of us are Frederick, Maryland-based historians, so it's a strong squad we have going on down here in old Fredneck. So represent. We want to keep Avery.
Does Frederick have like a slogan or like a fighting like mantra? I didn't think we did. Like, go Keys.
It's basically Frederick.
Yeah.
We're not Montgomery
yeah,
County.
Right? Yeah.
You know?
But we're not Washington County either.
I'm from Montgomery County for the record, so I can throw shade down south. Just, want to do that.
Shade.
How you doing, Matt? We're not the only ones out here in the COVID world. How are you with it?
Not bad. Doing a lot of writing, a lot of research, as you know. Seems like we're touching base on that almost every day, but making some good progress there, and trying to just use my time wisely.
Yeah, it is certainly a good time for writers and researchers, because you have just pretty much nothing to do but to get into your work. So, which is kind of what we're doing here today. Right. We're getting right into the work. So before we jump into the questions, Avery, let's talk about a little bit about what brought you to the show to begin with. We had you on to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Fredericksburg.
This was a big.
That's how you gotta say it.
Yeah, that's right. You gotta say it like all the guys in the audio clip from the movie Gettysburg.
Yeah,
that's right.
Man, as an audio music engineer kind of brain guy, that was such a poorly executed audio overdub. I was like, it's
frustrating.
It just kills me. But so we talked about the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is the way that I put things in my vernacular is it's a major league fight. It's one of the real big, sexy heavyweight fights in the American Civil War. And in 1862, that's saying something, because that's a year that's full of battles like that.
It is exactly the 10th costliest battle of the entire Civil War, so it makes the top 10, but it's at number 10. There's a couple that got disputed, but you're on the list.
So with that, we had Avery on to cover the action basically from the time we left the Maryland campaign, right as McClellan was sort of entering into what will become his Loudon campaign, not Wesley Merritt's Loudon Valley campaign in 64, but a lot of people don't really realize there is a Loudon campaign in 62 that McClellan is embarking on post-Battle of Antietam, which is where we picked up the story with you, Avery. And at this point, we had, some political upheaval. We had McClellan was removed from command of the Army of the Potomac. He was, replaced in favor of General Burnside, and the Army got going, and it steals a march on Robert E. Lee. And this is happening at a time when both of these armies are kind of whipped from a summer of campaigning and hard fighting. And so Lee, not really expecting the Army to move, kind of doesn't react to it until it's almost too late. However, due to some logistical hiccups and speed bumps and things like that, Lee is able to make up this lost ground. Burnside is not able to cross and occupy Fredericksburg in the Heights, and we end up here in this situation where we have a river landing, or the first beachhead established, I guess you could say, in U.S. military history.
Yes.
There's street to street, block to block, house to house kind of fighting going on in the town itself. That devolves into some really nasty open field charges at Marie's Heights. There is one of the biggest what-ifs of the war over on Prospect Hill when Jackson's line inevitably gets broken before he plugs that hole. And this battle ultimately results in several things. One, a big morale hit for the Union Army, lots of casualties, and it happens right at a time when the elections are, playing out. The midterm elections are playing out in the U.S. This is a big deal. So it's one of the more critical postscripts to the Maryland campaign, because it's sort of the other big campaign that plays out for the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's a lot going on in this battle, and our listeners had lots of questions, and we're really happy to have you back here. So what we're going to do now is go through some of those listener questions, give you a chance to answer, clarify, do whatever. And what we're going to do now is toss it to Matt for the first question. We'll get right into it, Avery. So Matt, fire away, buddy.
Well, Avery, actually, this one falls back even further because we briefly touched on your background with the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania area and some of the other things that occur on those various battlefields. So if you could clarify a little bit the the Union presence at Fredericksburg prior to the battle in the spring of '62. I don't think a lot of folks realize that there was a huge chunk of the Union Army right there at Fredericksburg in the spring of '62. And we touched on it briefly, but we had several requests for a little bit of clarification on that.
Absolutely. So kind of just to start off here, the Union Army, the Potomac, as we all know, in the spring of 1862 is embarking on that ambitious Peninsula campaign, the brainchild of George McClellan. But part of that campaign had multiple facets. And one of the facets of that plan was to have General Irving McDowell, the loser of 1st Manassas, who is now in command of the Union 1st Corps. These men will have such notable units like the Iron Brigade. A couple other notable units are going to be in that 1st Corps, but they're going to basically head down to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and act as a halfway point between the massive Union force on the James Peninsula and the Union infantry forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Because as we all know, in the spring of 1862, Jackson's over there. General McDowell is sent to Fredericksburg because of the major railroad line that runs down through that town. Also, the Rappahannock River offers a pretty significant force, but also if McClellan should run into issues down around the James Peninsula, McDowell and the Union 1st Corps can be, embarked or re-embarked, I don't know how that works, at Aquia Landing, floated down the Potomac River to the bay, dropped off on the peninsula. So it's all about how logistically sound these forces can be, but they select Fredericksburg because that's the halfway point between Richmond and D.C. There is a total of about 30,000 Union soldiers in this 1st Corps, and they're going to camp between Falmouth and Aquia Landing. They're going to lumber on Stafford Heights, the same hills that they're going to be camped on and entrenched on during the inevitable Fredericksburg campaign. And it is during their visit in the spring of 1862 that basically all the events that happen here set up what's going to happen in the winter. The bridges across the river, the railroad bridge, there is a wooden Citizen Road Bridge, a couple other bridges in the vicinity. They're all going to be burned or destroyed by Confederate militia. Now, there is the number of militia has always been speculated, but they're saying there's between 800 to 1,000 Confederate militia in the town of Fredericksburg by the spring of 1862. And even to them, 30,000 Union soldiers is not something to trifle with. So they burn the bridges and then they get out of Dodge. And so a couple times the Union forces will go across the river into the town of Fredericksburg to patrol the streets, patrol the nearby area, but there's not a lot of heavy Confederate resistance in the air, mostly just mounted militia, but that's of no real concern to General McDowell. But something that does happen here of major consequence is the mass exodus of runaway enslaved African Americans who are seeing this Union presence as a chance to escape. One of those guys is an enslaved man by the name of John Washington. His accounts is probably the best one of this exodus from Fredericksburg. He was sent by his master to run an errand, basically, to a neighboring house. And amidst all of this, they hear this kerfuffle of Yankees on the opposite end of the river. And so John Washington decides, to heck with this. I'm going to go check this out. Should be noted that John Washington was also separated from his mother and sister at a very young age, as many enslaved families were. They were sold separately, no pun intended at all there. That sounds awful, but yeah, they were sold separately. So John Washington basically was on his own in Fredericksburg. But he and a couple of other enslaved individuals will go down to the riverbanks near Sophia Street. And I believe it's late April, early May. I don't have the exact date off the top of my head, but basically they see Union soldiers on the banks, on the opposite banks, and Union soldiers wave, they wave back, and John Washington says, "Hey, I'm going over there." So he gets in a boat, rows over, and they welcome him into the lines. He's given blankets, they give him some coffee and a couple of their rations, and they're basically, a lot of these guys are just curious because many of them have never really met an enslaved African American before. So they're asking him all kinds of questions. If he wants to be free, would he like to be free? And he says, well, yeah, that would be nice. So they're like, well, hey, we need laborers. We can pay you if you stick around. And it's not an exact quote, but that's basically the job that he's going to get. Now, according to Rufus Dawes, as we know, he is a member of the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers, member of the Iron Brigade. It's his account that says there's roughly 10,000 African-American enslaved individuals crossing the Rappahannock. Now, that's just one account. We don't really have any other accounts, or none of the other accounts say a number. They just say a mass exodus. So we don't know the exact number. I just want to clarify that it's an estimation or an approximation. But to be fair, that's between the month of April and July. So about the 4 months that this First Corps is entrenched there, they're going to receive a lot of these runaway enslaved individuals. Another big thing that happens is President Abraham Lincoln is going to come visit. And he's actually a big history buff, as you know, Lincoln. He wants to see the childhood home, quote unquote, of George Washington. And he wants to go see Mary Washington's house, which is down along, I believe it is Caroline Street. I'm just going to double check that real quick. But nevertheless, there is a moment where Lincoln is actually riding through downtown Fredericksburg in an open carriage with the Union escort. And I just would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that. But
it's a little like weird Dealey Plaza imagery,
right?
Like president, open carriage, kind of thing. And
Yep. Yes, Mary Washington House. Okay, that is at Charles Street, so I was way off. But Charles Street in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Nevertheless, it's on that streets that you have a lot of these historical attractions that weren't attractions, of course, at the time. But to a guy like Lincoln, he wants to see these places. But nevertheless, as we know, in July, things do not go well for the Union forces on the peninsula. And as they withdraw, so does McDowell's forces. Not only that, things in the valley and the Shenandoah have not gone well either. So they are withdrawing back towards Washington, D.C. They're going to actually be molded into a brand new army. And Matt and Pat, they both know it is John Pope's Union Army of Virginia. And their first major action in an army will be at the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, as the Southerners like to call it.
Where things go really well for John Pope.
Things go so well for John Pope that he goes...
That's called sarcasm.
Makes an orderly withdrawal back to D.C. Yeah. But I hope that answers that question. I hope that shines a little more light on that Union occupation there. So they were there, but it's important to note, it was then that the bridges are destroyed. Those bridges are never rebuilt. That is very crucial.
Right.
Yeah, that definitely comes into effect, and I have a couple questions relating to that here on the schedule. So let's get into our next question. Is actually they didn't send in a name for this one, so I don't actually know who to give credit to. But this is a pretty good question. When we finally get into the sort of turning over the command of the army from McClellan to Burnside, Burnside has not just offered this command one time, and this is something that you and Matt were discussing actually on the big episode we all recorded together. And we had a chance to, kind of revisit this after the show. So why don't you kind of let the listeners, or I guess clarify for listeners, how many times has Burnside actually offered command of the Army of the Potomac before he accepts it?
So he is going to be offered, I believe we confirmed it was 3 times. And the first time I think was well before McClellan was actually relieved of command. So it should be noted that Lincoln was already deciding he's done with McClellan as early as November 5th. And those papers are put into processing on November 7th. And Lincoln is going to select General Burnside because of his overall experience in the year of 1862. He's the only general in the Union Army of the Potomac that has had an independent command with any bit of success the whole year. That, of course, alludes to the Coastal Carolina campaign in the spring of 1862. Pat, you're a big researcher on that. And,
we like to have a little back and forth because, in Fredericksburg, they do have the beachhead established on the riverfront. And we talk about this is the first time that American soldiers, make a landing under fire. And, it happens in some weird variation during the Revolution. But since my family has ties to Cape Hatteras and there was an 1861 landing under artillery fire on Hatteras Landing, we like to give a little beef back and forth on that. But I think the thing I think
you win that one, bud.
I think the thing we agree upon is that the landing at Fredericksburg is, in a traditional sense, there's small arms fire, there's short range combat being engaged. This isn't just, the long guns, the long arm of the Army playing here. This was at Fredericksburg. This was a, actual landing. Yeah. So Burnside does have some success down there.
So they relieve McClellan, I believe, on November 7th. And Burnside doesn't assume command until November 9th. Now, that just makes me think that for the 7th and 8th, Burnside was saying no. Like, he was offered it every day. They were like, hey, you going to take command of the Army? On the 7th, he was like, no, I can't do that to my buddy George. And then on November 8th, he's still, no, I can't do that to my buddy George. I'm not sure I'm the right guy for the job. I don't really, I've never commanded a force this large before. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of excuses and trepidation that Burnside had, which were pretty valid. I mean, he had never commanded an army of over 100,000 men before. And not only that, but it's a lot of shoes to fill, especially in a very crucial point on this campaign. But then rumor lets fly that if Burnside passes on this again, they will give it to Joseph Hooker.
Fighting Joe.
And Hooker and Burnside, do they like each other, guys?
No. Short answer.
Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. These guys detest each other. Burnside will not give Hooker the satisfaction. So on November 9th, he will assume command as commander of the Union Army of the Potomac. And really, to his credit, he gets to work right away with a plan. So, we did clarify it. It is believed 3 times in 3 days that he's offered command of this army.
Cool. All right.
Now, keeping with this end of the McClellan era for the Army of the Potomac and moving into this period, one of the reasons that we discussed why McClellan was removed was why he was retained for as long as he was and then removed very quickly at the beginning of November was because of the mid-year elections. How do these mid-year elections really affect, Avery, the progress of the war?
So, interestingly enough, the 1862 United States elections, they're occurring in the middle of Republican President Abraham Lincoln's first term. So, it's a third-party system, and a civil war is going on at the same time. Third-party system, I believe, is the let me see here. I believe they are
real-time fact-checking.
Yeah. I need that.
The web search.
I will get back to that that third party. But the point is that it's the 38th Congress that's being convened here. And interestingly enough, during these elections, both West Virginia and Nevada will join the Union during that 38th Congress. So this is their first midterm election. So now we got new states on the board. We got new delegates that need to be elected and whatnot. And as we all know, West Virginia, pro-Union. They're going to be part of the United States, not the Confederate States. No matter how many West Virginians can squirm, kick, and scream out there. Sorry, guys. West Virginia, 1862, joins the Union. So, Nevada. I know, right?
Interesting, Avery, because they're made a state the following summer, but they were actually allowed to have
They had delegates. They had delegates in the 38th Congress. Yep.
That's interesting. I didn't know
right?
that.
So, interestingly enough, I was a little wrong on this in the episode. You were right, Matt. The Republican Party does keep control of Congress, although very, very close.
Right.
So they were able to hold on to the Senate. However, the Republicans in the House, their plurality was reduced. In the House, Democrats won several seats, ending the Republican majority. But yes, Republicans won a plurality of seats, while several seats were occupied by politicians identifying as unionists. So I believe this is where it starts to split. You have the radical Republicans, and then you have the moderate Republicans who are like, yeah, we're pro-union, but, you know, we're not radical, we're not abolitionists or any of that crazy stuff, blah, blah. Then you got the Democrats who are very far right on the other side of things saying, you know, we're unionists, but at the same time, we're anti-war. It's already starting. There's not a lot of, the war has not gone well at this point. So already you see this, I wouldn't even call it Southern sympathies, but you could even, some of them I'm sure you could equate that to. And yeah, it's pretty darn close. And what that shows President Lincoln is that 2 years into this war, we are already seeing by the election results in Congress a growing anti-war movement. People are now not as this war is not as popular as it was at the start of 1861. There isn't that fiery notion to preserve the Union and put down the rebel. It's starting to wane because the cost is becoming so high. And to the credit of everything that's happened, 1862 is an incredibly bloody year, and it's only going to get bloodier. But in a nice, cool little note.
Oh, go ahead.
No, as a nice little tidbit, that is when Republican Schuyler Colfax wins election to Speaker of the House. And so, yes, Mr. Speaker is
right.
From Lincoln. He is finally cemented in the midterm elections of 1862. I'm saying Mr. Colfax. I'm sorry.
The Republican Party loses 2 states as well, the governorships, correct? New York and another big one, I think. But New York was the big one. That was definitely.
Oh goodness, I'm completely blanking on it. I want to say it was something. Truman Seymour? No, that's a general. Oh goodness. I should have been more prepared, but
We'll post a follow-up blurb to that one. All right, cool. So there's a lot going on in the nation. There are emancipation proclamations being issued. There are midterm elections that are happening, and everything is having a cause and effect on the other. And sort of forgotten in that conversation is the effect that the Emancipation Proclamation actually has on the Army itself, the Army of the Potomac. So Brian in Winchester wants to know, what is that effect? Like, what effect does the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one, actually have on the Army as this campaign gets going and stuff like that?
So from what we've read and what I've read in my work at the National Park Service, we basically came to the conclusion that a majority of the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, they are not going to be negatively reacting to the Emancipation Proclamation. Sure, you got your blowhards who are, down and out racist and are saying, I'm not fighting for the freedom of Negroes. That's not why I enlisted. That's poppycock. I'm not going to continue to fight. You also have that very famous rumor of McClellan organizing the Army to march on Washington to commit a military coup. McClellan was not in the loop on that. Spread either by his rivals or by his supporters, we don't know. But that's just some of the things coming out of the camp. And when you have that kind of rumor hit the newspapers, definitely not good, especially for McClellan's career. But nevertheless, there are a small portion of the Army as well, equally, are in favor of it. They get this rejuvenation in their spirits. They have this idea that now we have a pretty noble cause that we can get behind, and it's a very small voice at first. But if you look at the Army and how it matures through the years of the Civil War, by 1864, There are men who were so defiantly racist and bigoted towards black people in 1861 and 2 that by 64 and 5 are respecting these folks. And especially the Army of the Potomac members who see these men fighting in Union blue uniforms, like places like the Crater and Chafflin Farm at Petersburg. I mean, there's all these different accounts of that, but it seems like a majority of the Army is pretty indifferent to the proclamation, and that's not something that's new or strange. You talk to a lot of Army guys, a lot of military folk, they're like, politics at the moment's notice doesn't really matter to us. That's not our job. Our job is to fight the enemy. And there is this notion, a lost cause notion, I should note, that the Army of the Potomac majority is just furious at this Emancipation Proclamation. They're just as mad as the Confederates. That's not the case. That is not the majority of the Army. Sure, there are blowhards. Sure, there are voices, but no, there are just as many small voices saying, yeah, we support this, and then a majority of the voices saying, man, so what now? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's right. Just they're just trying to make sure they're paid, that they're fed, and that they fight well. I mean, that's all that these guys really care about at the end of the day. So does it have a huge effect on the Army and its morale? Absolutely not. But it definitely makes ripples in terms of the psychology of the Army and causation and how these guys come to grips with why they're at war.
Yeah. I mean, well, the Army might not have been affected by it, but the entire trajectory and history of our nation was affected by it. So,
exactly.
So that's awesome.
It makes it cooler because now you have an Army that is not realizing its significance. Yeah. And like, maybe that could be dangerous, but I think, in my opinion, it makes them more humble and able to do this job. Because
it relieves the burden of pressure, for
the
sure.
The pressure is not there.
Yeah, they're not fighting to do this. They're fighting just to defeat the enemy. And the extra larger consequences are just over their head right now.
Yeah, trust me, after this battle at Fredericksburg, all politics are out the window. It is kill or be killed after this battle. Much score settling will be happening.
Like Hoot and Black Hawk Down. Politics and all that other
yeah. Oh, matters made you fight. Hey, I'm glad you quoted that, man.
Matt. Matt. Movie quotes have been in the show at some point. Avery and I know too many movie quotes.
No, I get that.
Why are you fighting over here, man? All right, what else you got for me?
Now, before we leave the realm of politics completely and dive into the nitty-gritty of the fight at Fredericksburg, are you able to expound a little bit, Avery, on where's the beef, if you will, between Hooker and Burnside? Because it goes way back.
It does.
And I think it goes back to West Point, but I can't recall off the top of my head.
Is it overrated?
What are you babbling about?
I know, yeah, he's a babbling brook. But yes, the point is, I'm not actually sure on that question. Hooker and Burnside's relationship, it probably did go back to West Point. That's not unheard of. These guys were kids when they were there, and by kids I mean they were in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s. You're gonna make impressions, you're gonna prank each other, you're gonna get each other into trouble, and everyone at West Point is constantly trying to, impress the pants off the superiors there so they get good commissions and good accommodations. Burnside, he is kind of a by the books kind of guy. He's very much attention to detail. Everything's got to be ship shape and spot and whatnot. And I mean, that's part of the reason he gets this command, is because he's a guy who does play by the rules. He's a guy who does do everything by the book. Hooker is a little more radical in his approach. He's just as ambitious, but he has less, I want to say pomp and circumstance. He's pompous, but not as circumstantial.
All right, so I got a couple questions relating to the river crossing.
Okay.
We'll get to sweet. We'll get to the first one here. Mine comes from Daniel in New York, who asks, why go through the effort to bring down the pontoon bridges from Berlin? For those of you who don't know, that's modern-day Brunswick, Maryland. But why go through the effort to bring them down from Berlin instead of just constructing new ones and getting the Army going?
So basically at this point, you know, you could say, yeah, there's a lot of trees around there. They could definitely fashion rafts and whatnot. But ultimately, that's not this. You got to remember, this is 1862. And this army does not quite have all of its facets that it will have. Now, inevitably, by 1864, there's a whole department devoted to pontoons that run with the army in the event that they need to cross a body of water. I mean, look at the Army of the Potomac in 64. They have pontoons ready at the Rapidan. They're going to have pontoons ready at the North Anna. They're going to have pontoons ready at the James, of course. But this is 1862. And even if we cut down all these trees, where are you going to get the rope from? Who supplies that rope to fasten these things together? And goodness gracious, what happens if these man-made contraptions all fall apart in the river and we lose how many cannons, how many wagons? You know, there's those things that are going to be thought about here. And ultimately, it's the fact that these things were already constructed, they knew where they were, and if everything goes accordingly, they do get there on time. They got a long distance to travel, but, you know, if everybody keeps watching it, and if they don't get delayed in DC, if they don't get stuck in DC, you know, for a second, you know, what happens? What happens here?
I guess that's something that sort of popped in my mind while you're answering that is, you know, I would kind of wonder why they wouldn't just, as an army that's campaigning through an area where they know they have several river crossings to make at various places, whether it be the Potomac or the Rappahannock, or if they're successful and able to continue driving, you know, further rivers down, why would they just have that ability rolling with them? You know, so that's just something that just popped into my mind. I guess that's sort of the lessons you learn, maybe from battle, and maybe also the I guess maybe at the time they weren't expecting to have to need every resource in the world to win this war. I guess maybe in 1862 they were still kind of hoping to stamp it out without having to call in every resource imaginable.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that, you know, the resources are very limited. There's not enough pontoons going around. So we know where these are. This is the biggest concentration of them. That's why, you know, it's not like something we can just fashion. They have to be perfect. You know what I mean? Like, they can't, it's just, these things are a lot more feasible to lay across the river than just a few logs and stuff tied together. So, you know what I mean? It's just like, I've never built a pontoon boat or pontoon bridge before from scrap, but I can imagine it would take probably a little longer than it would to just get them floated down the river.
Now, I'm glad you asked that pontoon question, Pat and Avery. The way you answered it works really well for this next question I have, is that you had mentioned, and you just mentioned it again, that by 64, the armies are transporting their own pontoons.
Yep.
But how are they doing that? What is the actual system that they're using for that? Now, many of us have seen these things. They're big, flat-bottom boats. How are they moving these darn things?
So, actually, if you believe it, they have wagons for them. There's a picture, a couple of photographs that I found a couple of times. It looks like a Conestoga wagon at long glance, but in fact, instead of this canvas draped over it, it's the underhull of the boat that is sitting on top of the wagon, and they would stick like these things together vertically along the wagon, so it would look like, you know, it looks like it's a cover to the wagon, but it's really just these boats, and they would have the wood and everything fastened within it. So like with one planking, and you know, if you look at a section of a pontoon bridge, you got two of those flat bottom boats, and then the planking itself that goes over top of it. If you can imagine, that each can fit on at least one wagon. It might take two to transport that. Now, multiply that by how many spans of a pontoon bridge you need, and you mean, in the case of Fredericksburg, we had 3 crossings. You have about, I'd say almost 100 yards to cross, and so you know, these spans were about 10 yards long, and if you take that, that's like 10 spans. Or not 10 yards long. That was completely false. I'm sorry. I think it's like 10 feet is the word I'm looking for.
Those are huge.
They're huge. I'm thinking football fields. I was like 10 yards. That didn't sound right. But yeah, they're still big, but they're not 10 yards. They're about 10 feet long, and then you span those I don't want to do the math right now. I know I should have, but a lot of them, basically. So it takes a lot of wagons.
Like 30 to 40 per river crossing.
Pretty much, yeah. So you're going to need all those wagons, all those horses to be diverted from other departments as well to transport this stuff. And it just shows you just kind of what a logistical nightmare moving a Civil War army is. There's so much that goes into it in terms of just the amount of wagons used, the amount of horses.
They're using the C&O Canal lock system too, aren't they, to move these things?
Yeah, they're floating them at one point, and they can, float them down to D.C., but yeah, like I said, they get stuck at a wharf in D.C., and not until like Burnside inquires, like, hey, where are they? Did they get moving again? And they can get floated further downriver to Aquia Landing, but then they have to be brought from Aquia to Falmouth. Now, real quick, let me see the distance, because that was something I wasn't clear on in our episode. Distance from Falmouth to Aquia Landing, Virginia. That is roughly, drum roll, please. Nope, never mind. That's Falmouth, Massachusetts. Good God. Okay.
Tell me what, we'll do another one.
Falmouth, Virginia. Nope, I'm on it. Tell me
another drum roll, we'll do another one.
Drum roll, please. So, yeah, it's 12.7 miles from Aquia Landing to Falmouth. Now,
a long way to drag a boat.
In the winter, when it's raining and it's muddy, and these things are going to get stuck every, 3-5 feet? They just pancake and sink into the mud. So 12 miles might as well be 12,000 miles in the winter of the Civil War. And that's going to take time to get them overland to Fredericksburg. So ultimately, like I had said in the episode, Union Army itself, they reached Stafford Heights, or start to reach Stafford Heights by November 17th. Boats don't get there till November 27th. And that's just like the first spans of these bridges. And on top of that, goodness gracious, yeah, there's still that rain that's keeping the army from putting them across. So it's just delay after delay. Like every possible thing that could go wrong is going wrong for the logistical side of this campaign, for the Union at least.
So some things go right. Burnside gets to steal that march. He does, pull one over on Bobby Lee. That's that
campaign starts off great. It starts off great.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So we get to this point where things are going great, and then it all kind of comes apart logistically like that, right? And the ground gets kind of even. Lee is able to get down there and start to position himself. He occupies the heights. He puts a small force in the town, and that's where our second, my second listener question comes in from. It says, why didn't the Union? This is from Megan in Las Vegas, by the way. It says, why didn't Union troops attempt to land under the cover of the artillery instead of waiting for the gaps in the fire, which allowed Barksdale's men to recover and counterfire? Like now, I guess that question is thinking along the lines of the way we land or move in the First and Second World Wars. And
okay, yeah. So I'm glad you brought up the First World War. So a new innovation in First World War, and Pat, you can totally piggyback on this, the walking artillery, moving artillery forward. That is a new concept in the 1900s. And it's something that's not perfected. Like, I don't think still has been perfected. Because people can get killed by their own guns pretty darn easily. It's a very good question. Why didn't they just attack in? But that's simply it. In the 1800s, during the Civil War, the U.S. military does not have a system that coordinates infantry attacks with artillery bombardments. Generally, it's something you do one at a time. It's called a preliminary bombardment for a reason. You bombard first, and then you rush in and take it. Now, that same kind of tactic you do see in World War I, especially in the beginning years, where they'll pulverize the living hell out of each other, and then they'll just send waves of people over whatever's left. Now, as we know, if you're not dug in, like the standard tactic of the time, Napoleonic, Jomini, Clausewitz tactics, they're not really going to be dug in, or not supposed to be in 1862. But these Mississippians are in cellars. They're basically below ground. So they're going to survive this bombardment. And on top of that, it's an urban setting. So, if you're a Union soldier, how do you go about, even once you get to that other side of that river?
Right.
I mean, what do you do? Like, what's the next step? We don't have a doctrine in place to do so. So December 11th is a innovative day, really, for the U.S. military. Because now not only do they have to make that landing under fire, but they have to establish a bridgehead, a beachhead, quote unquote, and then continue into an urban fight. And that is going to devolve into just going house to house, like we do in Fallujah. That took weeks in 2004. So if that took a couple of weeks, I mean, it's amazing that this was only a day. Right. But, I mean, also numbers game, too, and that was never the initial ideal. But the fact is, the Union soldiers, even if they did have artillery attacking with them, I'm going to go out on a limb and say the Mississippians are going to have to be rooted out of those houses by force, by hand, pretty much.
Yeah.
The infantry is going to have to clear those houses themselves. The artillery can't do it for them.
One thing I also want to mention, as a bit of an artillery geek myself, is when you compare the Civil War artillery up against more modern, and I'm talking even like World War I modern. Let's say a
105 howitzer. Let's take a 105 millimeter howitzer.
The weapons of the American Civil War, both in the sophistication of the weapon itself and in how the aiming process works, are incredibly less sophisticated than they are in the First World War. You have bigger, badder weapons. We've got better math and calculus going into how we aim. We have forward observation spotting. We have aerial targeting, because we have the luxury, I'm going to say, of planes and better balloon. So in the American Civil War, it's straight up line of sight. And, when these battles are kicking off, they're not always kicking off at times when you can see. So if you don't really want to kill your own guys, which is the goal, right? It's just a preliminary bombardment. You're not going to just shoot feet in front of them as they're too much can go wrong in that circumstance.
And the fuses and whatnot certainly are not up to the same standards as those later conflicts that you mentioned, Pat. I mean, a premature detonation of those rounds is going to kill somebody, and that somebody's going to be on your team if that happens.
Yeah, if you're firing shell over the heads, over the back of your guys, and it explodes in the ascension part of its trajectory, and it's behind your ranks when it goes off, it just showers down into your back while you're advancing. That's
right.
A good way to take out 50 of your own guys real fast.
Oh yeah,
exactly.
So cool.
Well, I hope that answers that question. I hope
that's
a good question. It's a great question. Yeah.
Now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in regards to the fight here, Avery, but there was a concept that I really liked when we were discussing it during the original show. Could you expound on the idea that the federal attacks needed to, or did continue to, keep the Confederacy from doing so themselves? This idea that the Union needed to keep pushing just to keep the Confederates from not doing that.
So like the Union assault on Marye's Heights itself at Willis Hill, you mean, like the frontal charges?
Exactly.
Yes. So this idea isn't born until the afternoon on December 13th. And what really starts to put this thought in Burnside's mind is the fact that Jackson does counterattack off Prospect Hill. You have the fighting around Slaughter Pen Farm that sees a whole brigade of Georgians come within like 100 to maybe 50 yards of the old Stagecoach Road, which is the Union line. And Union artillery blows those Confederates, literally blows them right back up onto that hill. But the Union forces are much larger down on that southern portion of the field. They're also in a better position to receive an assault should it come down from the high ground. Now let's look at the units that have been making the charges in front of the stone wall. Those units have taken severe casualties. They're pinned down in the open. The only cover they have is a swale that's 500 yards back from the wall. And that swale really offers no protection at all. There's no trees there. There's nothing. These guys lay flat on the ground, hunkered down. They're using bodies of their fallen comrades as shields best they can. And the thing is that they can't withdraw. There's so much firing going on. The Confederates are going to fire 10,000 bullets per minute from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. They're going to expend an incredible amount of ammunition. because of this relay system. If you looked inside that stone wall at the sunken road, the Confederates have rows of men, and each row has a job. And if you looked at it, there's probably about 4 rows. The back row, these guys are the loaders. They have one job. It's continuously load muskets. The second and third lines, these are the relayers. They also are going to load a little bit, but they're going to be passing muskets forward. And then those first 2 rows along the wall, they're the shooters. And so you have this assembly line setting, passing loaded ammunition or loaded muskets with ammunition, continuously. And so it is an incredible volume of fire that's coming off that stone wall and making it impossible for units to withdraw in an orderly fashion, which is why many of them go to ground. So when you have not just a regiment, but multiple brigades that have made these charges going to ground in the same swale, everyone's disorganized, everybody's pinned down, there's a lot of wounded and a lot of dead and dying, and it's just a mess there. Now, imagine, if you will, if Longstreet decides to say, all right, go up over the wall, charge. There's no way those Union forces have the organization or the numbers to withhold it. Longstreet's got 40,000 men in his corps. He had plenty in reserves that don't see action on December 13th. He doesn't need to use them. It's an almost near perfect defensive position in that stone wall. It's not perfect because obviously, as we know, Confederates still die there. It's perfect if no one dies. But the fact of the matter is that Longstreet's got plenty of reserves, and he can throw them down there if he so chooses. But you can't very well meet a oncoming charge head on. This isn't a medieval battle. No one's that suicidal in the Civil War. So it's one or the other. It's got to be an ebb and flow. They attack, they fall back, we attack, we fall back, kind of that seesaw action. So by continuously attacking your enemy, you are denying them the chance to counterattack. And that is why we're going to do it in the afternoon after the slaughter pen fighting at this area, because we don't want that to happen. We don't want a literal slaughter pen in the ground in front of that stone wall. So that is why you have units attacking until dark, because darkness is still 1862, so darkness is still the official cutoff time. We're not going to fight into the night. Of course, that changes at Chancellorsville and other coming battles in the war. But at Fredericksburg, the Confederates are not going to attempt it. Plus, I'm not sure Longstreet was even wanting to counterattack. I haven't really looked into his memoirs as much. But according to E.P. Alexander, Confederates were pretty content on the night of December 13th to stay where they were at.
Hey everyone, this is Avery Lentz, host and creator of Battles and Banter Podcast. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, and other major listening platforms, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
All right. Welcome back to the History Things Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today is my co-host, Matt Borders, and our very special guest, Avery Lentz. Once again, we are going through some of the follow-up questions from listeners regarding the big battle episode, big discussion we did regarding the Battle of Fredericksburg, again, December of 1862. So we've had some really cool questions in regards to river crossings and things like that, the action on December 13th, why is Marie's Heights such a great defensive position, things like that. So really awesome questions from our listeners. And again, we thank you, Avery, for joining us. So getting back into it here, my next question comes from Mike down in Waldorf, Maryland. I do a ton of work with my company in Waldorf. So Mike down in the Dorf asks, why wouldn't Lee, and we're going back to sort of the street fighting time and the river crossing and all that. He asks, why wouldn't Lee have left a more sizable force in the town or like closer to the town in order to support Barksdale against the inevitable Union beachhead? Like if they knew this was the only way for them to come into the town, I guess Mike's asking, why wouldn't Lee have put more of a roadblock right in front of the infantry right in the town as opposed to letting them get into town and make those charges up Marie's Heights?
That is a great question. So we have to put ourselves in Robert E. Lee's shoes, and not just his, but the Army of Northern Virginia. I'll even pose this to you guys in a rhetorical sense. So Pat and Matt, is the Army of Northern Virginia in a bad spot at Fredericksburg?
No.
Not at all. And they are sitting, they're sitting on 5 miles of hills. they know they have a really good defensive position. In fact, Lee's going to say multiple times that he is absolutely dumbfounded at why the Union are even attempting to cross, because he knows how this is going to play out. If they even should attempt to make a charge on our heights, we'll repulse them. And I mean, they've had plenty of time to bracket and coordinate and do all this. Barksdale's only mission is to harass and delay. It was never supposed to hold there for any longer than a day. If not, in fact, Barksdale was only supposed to be in town for a tops of 3 hours, and then he was supposed to fall back. Like 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. was all he was supposed to be there for. However, he has such overwhelming success shooting up engineers that can't shoot back that, yeah, I know, right? Point is, yeah, screw you, Barksdale. Anyway, the point
this is why we love Avery coming on the show, boys and girls.
Yeah, the point is that Lee doesn't want to, the Confederates don't know how to street fight either. That should be made very clear here. As made even clearer on the first day of Gettysburg when they are charging into Gettysburg. Oh my goodness, do they get disorganized there? So, I mean, we want to avoid street fighting if we can. So we don't want to send a large unit in there. Can you imagine, guys, if Lee had sent a whole division into Fredericksburg? How disorganized that mess would have been. He could have lost a whole division of his army by doing that, in my opinion. Barksdale's able to make a withdrawal because he's got a smaller force. He's got a brigade size. And, the fact of the matter is, Union has the harder job because they are sending larger forces over. But if you notice, if you look at the maps of the street fighting on the 11th, they send units in piecemeal. They send regiment by regiment of individual brigades of the 2nd Union Corps. They're not sending everybody in at once because we just don't know how to fight in a street, and we can't send large units in. They'll clog up. It'll be a mess. So that's really one of the main reasons why Lee's not sending more forces in. Number one, not meant to hold the town. We're not trying to hold Fredericksburg. We're just trying to delay and slow it. And Barksdale did a good enough job as he did on his own. Secondly, we want to conserve our forces. Lee's still outnumbered. We have to remember that. He's still outnumbered. He cannot just throw units away. Not that the Union really can't either, but we still want to make sure that we're not just wholesale sacrificing a whole division to street fighting that's not going to accomplish anything except loss of life and destruction of property. And thirdly, yeah, Lee knows that the main battle is gonna, if this is the Union forces getting across, then yeah, sure, let them cross here, because then they'll only have 3 avenues of of withdrawal. They have the upper, middle, and lower crossing. That is the only way the Union gets out of here. By crossing the river, by putting a river to your rear and having heights to your front, you're in a terrible position. Because now you have to succeed, you have to go forward, you have to assault these heights. And that would get to the point, and I'm sure that is a question, why would Burnside do this? Why would he do this? Why would he do this? Well, as we see at Prospect Hill, it's not impossible. They do break through the lines there. It's just, the fact of the matter is that the Confederates do have a better position defensively, and the Union forces are in the lowland. So ultimately, Lee is going to, I know, the point is that generally he's going to try to wait for the Union forces to come to him. He's trying to conserve his forces here. This is, I would say, Fredericksburg has been called the perfect style battle that Lee, if he wants to win the war, these are the types of battles he has to fight. Because he's going to take less casualties, significantly less casualties than the enemy, and he's on the defensive. And Lee hates being on the defensive, doesn't he, guys? So this is kind of out of character for Robert, who's been aggressive and offensive for most of the year, and now he's just sitting and waiting for the enemy to come to him. And I think that probably was driving him nuts, but he ultimately saw the benefit in doing so.
Worked well
I also wonder if he didn't realize initially just how successful that delay in action was going to be.
I don't think so. I think it took him some time to realize when it was like 3 p.m. and Barksdale's still down in the, or not 3, 2 p.m. and Barksdale's still down in, 2 o'clock. And he's just now retiring. He's like, really?
Right.
Wow,
exactly.
Dude, good job. You know what I mean?
Good job,
the thing
boys.
is, I mean, yeah, William. But Barksdale's guys, I mean, they do take casualties, but it's not terrible casualties.
Right.
And it's like, wow, they were overly successful in delaying it. But yeah, we don't want to send units down into town to get quagmired in those streets, because it's slow on the Union progress. It's what slows the Confederate progress at Gettysburg. Stay out of the streets. Stay out of town when you're fighting a Civil War battle. Gosh, can't even. Ugh. I would not want to have been in that situation at all. Whether you're at Fredericksburg or Gettysburg, no street fighting for Avery. That's what I say.
Yeah, that's probably wise. Avery, my last question actually comes from a Park Service vein, since you and I are both green and gray. You have to have had guests who thought Marie's Heights was the only aspect of the battle.
Yes.
Like that was the whole fight. So could you tell us and our listeners a little bit about how do you get to Slaughter Pen Farm? I'm sure you were telling folks that all the time.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull up my trusty dusty Google Maps here to make sure I have the perfect and most accurate roads possible. But really, Route 2 is the name of that road today. It also goes by the Bowling Green Road because it goes down to the village of Bowling Green, Virginia. You can take Route 2 pretty far down, actually, until it links back up with Route 17, which takes you all the way to Virginia Beach. Gosh, I love Virginia. But the point is, Route 2, one second.
It's for lovers.
It is for lovers.
That's what I'm told.
But yeah, oh goodness, hang on, I'm pulling up the maps.
Hey, real quick, while you do the web search there, buddy, how, like, percentage-wise, would you say north or south of 40% of people are unaware of the rest of the battlefield when they're at Marie's Heights?
Are unaware? I would say,
like, when you're there, I'm giving you the over/under of 40. Is it over or under 40% that people aren't even aware of places like Prospect Hill and things like that?
I would say now, today, it's under. More people know about Prospect Hill. It's still like, if you go to Fredericksburg, the thing to see at Fredericksburg is the stone wall. That's what the takeaway is. Just like, I don't know, Little Round Top at Gettysburg, or I don't know, Henry Hill at Manassas. There's that. It's that major. What's that?
Sunken Road, the Bloody Lane.
Bloody Lane, yes. At Antietam, or the cornfield at Antietam. You know what I mean? So it's like the sight to see when you're in Fredericksburg. But nevertheless, it's still more and more people have started to give more attention to Prospect Hill. And I think that's really cool.
Absolutely.
Especially,
so that's just the last several years, you think?
I would say it's in the last. I'd say it's in the last decade, honestly, because as we all know, in 2002 or 2003, whenever that freaking nightmare came out, Gods and Generals, of course, did a really good job in doing the Marie's Heights attacks, but they completely left out Prospect Hill. So people, if they've seen Gods and Generals and have never been to Fredericksburg, they're only getting one side of that narrative. So they think that, this is the battle where the Union just got their butts handed to them, and they just made these useless, futile assaults, and why did they do that? I'm like, well, firstly, they understand that the movie left it out why the Union are doing that, and it's because of what's going on south of them. 5 miles to the south, you have the fighting around Prospect Hill. Now, if you are finding yourself in Fredericksburg in the next couple of months, the visitor center is closed due to the pandemic, darn COVID. But if you go from the visitor center, you want to proceed down Lafayette Boulevard. I will go nice and slow for everybody.
Named for Lafayette McLaws?
Probably.
No.
No, I'm just kidding. The Marquis de Lafayette.
The better Lafayette.
The better Lafayette. Oui, mon ami, je m'appelle Lafayette.
Lafayette.
Yes, as we know, there's a lot of colonial Revolutionary War history in Fredericksburg as well. The Lafayette, French general, goes through the wilderness, actually, in 1781 on his way down to Yorktown. So That's pretty cool.
We got some ties to Lafayette right here in Frederick. Did you know that?
We do. Yep. We do. Yes, I did know that.
Yeah, he comes here as an old man, but he comes here.
We owe that man everything. No. But anyway, go down Lafayette Boulevard. You want to turn right onto Charles Street. Charles Street. And that will take you to Dixon Street. And then Dixon Street turns into Route 2. And Route 2 is the highway. It's a small, it's not even an interstate anymore. It's just a route. It'll take you all the way to Slaughter Pen Farm Historic Site, which will be on your right. So, repeating, Lafayette Boulevard to Charles Street, which will be and empty out onto Dixon Street, which becomes Route 2. And the Slaughter Pen traveling south will be on your right. Going north, it'll be on your left. And definitely get out there because down in the southern portion of the battlefield, it is the best preserved area of the battlefield. If you go to Maurice Heights, the town is literally right up on it, and there's really nothing at the stone wall to give any depth to the open ground that was once there. The Park Service is looking to reacquire some of the properties along one of the streets here. 1 second. It is the streets, I believe it's actually Shepherd Street and Willis Street. They are looking to, at some point, start to reacquire some of the houses, specifically along Willis Street, and then bulldoze them once those people give them the go-ahead to do so. And then at one point reopen, at least get another 100 yards of ground in there, which I think is really good, because if you can get at least 100 yards of ground from that stone wall, like from point A to point B, then at the other end of that 100 yards is where the Union line with the Union troops, most of the brigades, were able to get to. Couldn't get any physically closer because of the volume of fire, unless with the Irish Brigade, because you're made of metal, or Andrew Humphrey's Pennsylvanians, which just happened to go forward at the right moment when
Bala, let's go, baby! Irish Brigade!
I knew you wore that shirt for a reason, Pat.
You know, there be people. There be people. The Irish Brigade be people.
But yes,
that is weirdly one of the best worst scenes in that movie.
I know, right?
Like, I love it. It hits me in the feel, and then that guy starts talking like, "You go to hell and damnation," and I'm like, ah.
Oh, you mean yeah. I do like St. Clair and Mulholland. It's the only time St. Clair and Mulholland will probably ever be portrayed on film. So,
but Mulholland wouldn't even rules. But like St. Clair Mulholland wouldn't have even been in that position with those guys.
No, he wouldn't have.
Like, there's so much jacked up about that scene on top of that jacked up movie.
Let's not get down the rabbit hole. Let's not get down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, right. That's a deep rabbit hole.
Here all night.
That was one thing we decided we weren't going to do, was rabbit holes, and also we weren't really going to touch on the Gods and Generals movie, because that's something that all three of us can stay on forever. So,
too bad.
So here's what I'll do then. We'll start winding it down here. I have my last listener question. And then Avery, if you'll permit me, I actually have a question for you.
Sure, buddy.
Both are kind of opinion questions, so these are for you, and a little less the historical record itself.
Let me get my sermon, my priest call.
Yeah. You get up on the pulpit, get your soapbox, get ready to go.
The bloody pulpit.
So our last listener question comes from Ryan and Brewer, who asks, what do you speculate some of the consequences could have been if Burnside had been able to cross the river, if everything had logistically worked out? What if he had been able to cross the river before Lee had caught up to him? What do you think some of the consequences of that would have been?
That's a good question.
That is a very good question. It's one that I've thought about many, many times, to be honest. The whole idea of this what if everything goes accordingly. Well, first things first, there's no Battle of Fredericksburg. It just, that hands down is my opinion. If Burnside can cross on schedule before Lee is anywhere near Fredericksburg, then obviously you're not going to have a battle there. Burnside's going to continue south. If he can, he's going to use the railroad to transport his supplies. He's going to move very quickly. And he might find a way to get down to North Anna if that was his original plan, to get to the North Anna River, get to the high ground south of that river. And that probably is where his destination was going to be. He's going to dig in defensively. And some people would say, oh, he'd go on to Richmond. But I'm like, the whole idea is not to capture Richmond anymore. I'd say the on to Richmond crap ended in the summer when on to Richmond.
On the peninsula, right?
On the peninsula, yes. So Burnside and Grant actually have very similar ideas because they both want to fight they both want to get towards Richmond but not take it, because they know if they go towards Richmond, Lee's going to have to follow them. So I think, in just my opinion, Burnside's going to find a place where he can fight defensively, but he'd put himself between Lee and the capital of Richmond. Now, here's the big thing. If you want to get real into this what if, that's still giving the initiative to Lee. Do we get a Chancellorsville type of situation in the winter with Lee going on the offensive, trying to assault Burnside? Now, there's a chance that, Lee could run into the same weather issues trying to pursue Burnside, and maybe during the campaign of what ifs, bog down and get into problems. I mean, there's so many things that could happen here, but ultimately, if we go into a offensive campaign with a tactically defensive mindset, we are already limiting ourselves to various outcomes. And you're always going to be giving the enemy the initiative there, which is extremely dangerous, because as much as I can't stand Robert E. Lee, got to give the guy at least a few little tidbits that he is a little more aggressive than Ambrose Burnside. And who knows? I mean, that's all. I mean, maybe we have a Battle of North Anna in the winter of 1862 instead of Fredericksburg. Maybe that is a Union defensive victory. Maybe it's a Confederate offensive victory. I have no idea. But ultimately, if Burnside, one thing I can answer here is if Burnside does get across that river, we don't have a battle at Fredericksburg. We don't have a fight in Spotsylvania County. It's just hands down.
What ifs are fun, and also I think my toddler might be more aggressive than Burnside at times. So there's that. Real quick before my question for you, if you're permitting me, I just think what ifs are both a lot of fun and really dangerous, because I think what ifs can be dangerous in the sense that they take you away from the narrative, from the fact, and you do get lost in those weeds from time to time. So make sure that if you are going to do a what if, that you do kind of base your theories in as much fact as you can, because
that's why I can't really answer those. Like, it's just so open ended. We don't know. Like,
one of the big what ifs we talked about on the show with you was what if Reynolds had been where he was supposed to have been.
If they get reinforced?
When the breach happens and Meade starts calling for him, what kind of battle is it at that point? So, in my opinion, right there, it's a completely different battle. And maybe Lee has to shift away a ton of resources from Marie's side. So, what ifs can be fun in that exercise, but they can also be dangerous, because people will do that. What if Jackson had been at Gettysburg, until they're blue in the face, and like, that's a stupid and dangerous one. So, but I enjoy the what ifs, and that was a good fun what if question, because you do have things like the railroad involved, and what if Burnside is able to, because I mean, let's be real, right? If he gets across the river and is able to use the railroad, the distance between him and Lee, like, he's going to put distance, because the railroad is going to move his arm. And that would make things very interesting for how the war goes. So great answer, Avery. So we'll wrap up the questions with one from me. And it's not like I thought of this question. I can't take credit for it. But it is a very simple, but it is a cool, kind of provoking question. One of our listeners, a good friend of ours, Jim, down in Falls Church, asked Kevin Pollack, who I know you know, was our first guest. He covered the Maryland campaign for us, the story that led into your story. And one of the questions that was posed to Kevin was, what is the most significant, or in your opinion, what do you think is the most significant place or moment on the battlefield during the overall Battle of Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, and this can range anywhere from, the river crossing to the retreating actions. But what do you think, in terms of the Battle of Fredericksburg, is the most significant moment, in your opinion, Mr. Avery Lentz?
Well, in my opinion, hands down would have to be Prospect Hill. Would have to be the exact place where Meade breaks through. Because honestly, so much could go multiple directions from what happens there. That's that what if again. But ultimately, this is where the fight is going to be won or lost. Whether they're able to, realize it quick enough or not, no one's breaking through at Willis Hill. Not with the topography against them, not with the defense in depth, and not with just the obstacles they're going to hit. But at least at the southern portion of the line, it's a fight. And casualties down there are pretty close together. At Willis Hill, at the stone wall, you have 1,000 Confederate casualties to 8,000 Union. That's abysmal. But down around Prospect Hill in the slaughter pen, you have 5,000 Union casualties to about 4,000 Confederate. So that's where the fighting is done, is around Slaughter Pen Farm, is around Prospect Hill, is at that breakthrough. And I would say it's probably the most important part on that battlefield, because everything, you can funnel all the hopes of this campaign, all of the future events that we know are going to happen as people looking back on history. There's so many ways history can take different tangents here. That's our Avengers Endgame moment right there. If this is one of the Infinity Stones, it's right here on Prospect Hill. You know what I mean? Like, you can definitely see different threads coming out of this one moment. And definitely, I would say it's one that just gives a different narrative to the Union, because so much has Fredericksburg become a narrative of, these Union idiots who just get slaughtered senselessly for no reason. But the narrative at Prospect Hill is very different. It's a Union Army that we all are much more familiar with. It's aggressive. It's a fighter. It's not going to go down without a fight. And it actually has a chance of success. And so I do appreciate Prospect Hill for the narrative purpose, because so much we've let the Lost Cause tell us all kinds of crap about how the Union just was outside of their element at Fredericksburg, but that's not the case. There are a couple times where the Confederates could have lost it. And, we, like you said, Pat, I don't want to get down into any what ifs, but I mean, goodness, the fighting there, it's crazy enough, scary enough that Jackson ordering that counterattack down the hill is almost in a way to redeem himself from realizing that, my line just got broke through because I got duped. Just to refresh, he takes D.H. Hill off the line, sends him to go watch Doubleday, and he leaves a gap. And that's ultimately what leads to this predicament in the first place. There's no doubt in my mind Jackson realized he'd made a mistake. And so if you can unnerve Stonewall Jackson, unnerve him enough to send basically one or two brigades down to the lowlands to get slaughtered by artillery, then you've done a pretty darn good job. And I think that if you do go there, it's the best preserved spot on the battlefield. It's also just a very interesting place to be. There's a lot of really cool trails around there, and you can hike the entire length of Prospect Hill all the way back to Hood's line, the Hood's marker at Lee Drive. It's just a really interesting prospect to just walk the ground where this battle was just not one-sided, and it was up in the air for at least 2 hours or more.
Sure. So before we get out of here, Avery, why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners where they can catch up with you, where they can find all the cool Avery Lentz action, and on social media and stuff like that. Tell them about what it is that you do, brother.
Yeah, so I am the host and creator of Battles and Banter Podcast. We're a chill military history podcast that approaches military history, which can be a very dense subject, as you listeners out there probably know. When we get lost in our deep dives, it can seem very arduous, but on my podcast, we still deep dive. I will admit it wholesale, but we deep dive with some alcohol, with some profanity. We're a little more laid back. I try to use humor to educate, approaching very dense, very dark subjects like war, but also lightening the load a little bit, and kind of making it approachable to everybody. So you want to check us out, you want to give us a shot, you can find us on iTunes, you can find us on Spotify, on Google Music, basically the major listening platforms. That's Battles and Banter Podcast. And also very much I appreciate a follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On battle anniversaries and major events in history, I'll make posts here and there to kind of keep you in the loop. And, right now is May 6th, so it's the second day of the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864. And it's my favorite Civil War battle in the entire war, as Pat knows and Matt knows. So definitely give us our social media follows. Kind of on a Twitter hiatus right now because Twitter was bumming me out and I get sad easily.
Twitter is a bit of a wild world.
Yep.
Yes,
but
Facebook and Instagram, definitely. Give love to our Instagram page, please. I'm trying to reach 500 followers by the summer. So, it's really, we're more just a personal goal, but please give us a follow if you don't already. So thanks, guys, absolutely, for having me. This was a blast. And
well, thanks for coming out. Speaking of
Avery,
500, sorry, Matt, go ahead. I was going to say, speaking of 500.
I was just going to do it.
We got our own 500 announcement to make.
Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah.
We hit 500 downloads.
That's right. Matt Borders and I, right here on the History of Things podcast, in just over 2 months of being on the air, have already had 500 people check out the show. So we want to thank you, Avery, for being a big part of helping that happen.
Most definitely.
Well, that's all Kevin, but thanks. Just kidding.
Yeah. It was totally a Kevin Pollak boost.
Totally a Kevin Pollak.
It's called the KP bump.
The KP bump.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining me this evening, guys. Once again, this has been the History of Things podcast. I'm Matt Borders, as always, with my co-host Pat McGuire and Avery. It's been a pleasure, as always, my friend, and we will talk to you guys again real soon.
Bye, guys.